All right. Speak, Lord, for your servants are listening. Amen.
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 So when we last left our heroes, some of them weren't really heroes anymore, and some of them had basically left the story.
Mm-hmm.
So David has shown up and he's ready and raring to go. Meanwhile, Saul has been double fired now, and Samuel is not going to see Saul again until the day of his death, keeping in mind that this is the kind of until where it's not, and then immediately at that point it does happen or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But we are not likely to see Samuel for a little while. So, do we have any outstanding questions about?
Yeah, I was just wondering, is there another book in the Bible that goes into the history of Saul and David, or is that it? Is it just Samuel?
Well, the Book of Chronicles picks up like at the exact moment of Saul's death, basically.
Okay.
So it mentions it briefly. And then there's a lot of Psalms that are written around this time by David. But aside from that, there's not a whole lot else from this time period in terms
Okay.
of, because most of the prophetic books that we would think of were written later than this.
Okay. And is there any secular writing on that about Saul? Or?
No, not really. We are like, in terms of historical periods, we are kind of like on the cusp of where we can get like historical data outside of the Bible.
Okay.
Basically, like there's a lot of historical evidence about King Solomon, because he like builds a lot of stuff, and so you can see the remnants of stuff that he built. Like nobody's lived there in a while, but you could go to like Megiddo, for example, and see what's left of the fortress there, which is little enough that it had to be, dug up. But there was something there, that sort of thing. The closest we get to like outside sources for David is like there's some stuff from like 100 or so, maybe 200 or so years later that mentions like a house of David, which indicates, that people understood that the kings of Judah were descended from David. But we don't have a whole lot from this time. I mean, keep in mind that these guys are going around in like tents or like incredibly old cities. So we don't have a whole lot more information about them than what the Bible gives us.
Okay.
All right. So going to get into one of the classics of Sunday school. And I think this one actually does, no, I'm not actually sure if this does show up in the lectionary. Maybe in the 1 year, but not in the 3 year.
Okay.
It's weird. We say that the 3 year covers more of the Bible, and that's technically true, but it's not 3 times as much. It's, yeah.
Okay.
Sometimes the readings are just shorter than the 1 year, and then you get some readings that are repeated occasionally, and then the 1 year sometimes has multiple options for readings for a specific day. So in the end, it's not like 3 times as much. It is more, but not as much as you'd initially assume.
Okay.
But for now, let's, if you don't mind, just starting going to, let's say, verse 7.
7. Including 7? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes Damim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." Oops, I think I went too far. Yeah.
All right. All right. So we've got all sorts of interesting things here. So we've got Goliath from Gath. Obviously, Gath is one of the cities of the Philistines, just to the west of Judah. And he's a very interesting figure because, well, he appears to be a giant. The Hebrew text that we have in the Masoretic text says that he's 6 cubits and a span. Apparently the Septuagint, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and Josephus say that he was 4 cubits and a span. So the question is, was he tall or really, really tall?
Okay.
Basically, 6 cubits and a span would be like 9'9", whereas 4 cubits and a span would be like 6'6",
Okay.
which I will say is still incredibly tall at the time, because we're actually taller than they would have been at the time.
Yeah.
Things like easier lives and better nutrition result in us growing taller than they would have back then.
Well, even
So,
6'6" is tall, even by
Yeah.
our standards.
yeah, I mean, by our standards, it's still pretty tall. But he's definitely a big guy, that's for sure. And we'll remember perhaps that Saul was remembered as being a large guy. He was a head taller than everybody else. So Saul is supposed to be a fairly tall fellow as well, but Goliath seems to be towering over them, at least in a psychological sense, because we don't really have anything about Saul being tall in this story. So what is the deal with Saul? I mean, with Goliath? Why is he so tall? What's his deal? So basically, I've been on this binge lately trying to figure out what the deal with giants are. And it's kind of complicated, not exactly. Basically, the gist of it is somebody somewhere is doing something that they're not supposed to do in a way that has to do with some stuff that happens in the beginning of Genesis. And what's the best way to explain it? He's not a great guy. All right, actually tiptoeing around this is way more confusing than actually saying what's going on. Okay, so basically what the deal is with giants, and there is disagreement with about this. I'm not going to sit here and say this is what everybody thinks about the Bible, but I do think that this is a defensible position, which is why I'm going to say it and defend it. All right, so in the book of Genesis, you may remember that in Genesis 6, right before the flood happens, it says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives of them, whichever they chose. So basically, my constant thought about this forever was like, but like, that can't be talking about angels, because angels shouldn't be able to reproduce with humans. Like, that's like the obvious like metaphysical thing that you're going to think of, like that shouldn't be possible, because like there's no reason why that should be a thing that could happen. But basically, it seems that what would happen in areas around Israel, like things that they would see the pagan cultures doing, is there was like some sort of ritual that would happen where usually like a king or something would be like understood to be like ritually embodying one of the gods, and then sleeping with a concubine. And then if they had a child, that child would be understood to be basically a demigod, a demigod. Sorry, a demigod. I don't know why, but I kept trying to say demagogue instead.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
in ancient mythology, you get things like, what's his face? Gilgamesh, for example, from the Epic of Gilgamesh, is understood to be that kind of guy. And so it's sort of like a demonic parody of the incarnation, you could kind of say. And so the one thing that you don't want to do with this idea is to like get obsessed over it and start like getting into really weird stuff. I think the most important thing with this idea is to understand how it sort of like points us towards Jesus as like the fulfillment of this idea in the opposite sense, in the way that like cannibals secretly wish that they were having the Lord's Supper. Like that's what they really want, because that's like the actual good stuff. They don't have to eat dying humans, but instead can eat the body and blood of Jesus Christ and have eternal life. So too, in this case, we've got something where like they want some sort of divine man to help their deal with their problems, but that's not what they're getting. Now, these giants are human beings. Like it's not like they're creating some sort of like semi-divine thing. Like they are human beings. They're probably just like predisposed to like demonic interference or something like that. But yeah, from what I understand, this is not like what everybody has always believed about this, but it seems to be the older understanding of what was going on. Like the book of Enoch, for example, which is not, it was a popular book around the time that the New Testament was written. Like that's what it would have understood was going on. And so this explains why the Nephilim exist before the flood, but then also after the flood afterwards, because it's not like they survived the flood. They were just existing before the flood. And then this happened after the flood also.
Yeah. So wait a minute, are you saying that the book of Enoch talks about the Nephilim as well?
Yeah. In one of the sections called the Book of Giants, this is the explanation it gives for where giants come from. Although sometimes they have a bit of a wackier understanding of what's going on. For example, there's one Jewish tradition that says that the giants survived the flood by just like being very tall and having their heads stick up over the water. But like, if that's what they're doing, then like, what was even the point of the flood? If just have higher water, like.
They weren't that tall. Come on. Yeah. So, okay, so in other words, it's like the giants were giant because their parents were evil, and somehow the evil resulted in bigger
well,
kids.
well, this is the part that where it kind of gets a little bit iffy, is like, why are they actually tall? Like, what's the deal with that? We do see, for example, like in earlier parts of the Old Testament, Og, king of Bashan, he had a bed that was like 15 feet long or something and made of iron. I think that the actual deal here is not that, you know, because they were evil, that made them tall. I think that what's actually happening is that some of them just are tall, and because of the way that their society works, those ones just sort of naturally rise to the top. Like when you have a society where the strong pick on the weak, and you know it's led by forceful personalities and that sort of thing, it makes sense that the biggest and nastiest of them would become the most powerful and well-known. And so that's, I think, what's going on. I mean, there might be like some sort of slight changes. I mean, who knows what a slight change in somebody's DNA could do in terms of like.
And then maybe those tall people sought out tall mates so that they could make more tall kids, and you know.
I mean, we do know that it is possible for human beings to be that tall. I mean, there's like, I've seen a picture of a guy who became incredibly tall, and then I think he died in his 20s, because it turns out that being tall isn't always very good for you.
Mhm.
Speaking from personal experience, your extremities start to get a little cold. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I know was it Phil and Mariam were in the airport in Holland a few years back, and they said they felt short. This everybody there was so freaking tall. They
mm,
said it was so weird. I mean, Philip is 6 feet tall, but he felt
mm,
short. There were so many tall people in Holland. Oh,
mm. Well, perhaps we should return to
yes.
the actual text. So they've got this one guy, Goliath of Gath, and he's kind of a throwback, actually, because Israel has not really confronted somebody like this for a while, basically since the book of, I'd say, Joshua, I think. Basically, most of these guys are dead by this point. Um, so it's almost like they're using some sort of like weird throwback technology. I kind of picture it as if like you line up on the lines of battle today and you look across at the other side and you see a guy in like 19th century French military outfit. And you're like, is that Napoleon? I mean, kind of a throwback, but like, am I gonna have to fight Napoleon? Like, that's kind of scary. Like, he's supposed to be like a good general or whatever. Not sure I want to do that. Because like he's got all this stuff made of bronze, which is at this point kind of outdated. Um, but then he also has a very impressive metal spear. Um, so
Bronze
he's
was
got,
outdated at this time.
well, yeah, because this is we've reached the Iron Age at this point. The Bronze Age collapse was around the time of the Judges, and you can kind of tell because the time of the Judges does feel like a time of kind of general societal collapse, and they constantly are getting like raided and invaded and stuff, as if all of civilization around them is falling apart. The Bronze Age collapse is kind of weird. I want to look into that more, but basically it seems like at the end of the Bronze Age, things just goofed up. And speaking of the Bronze Age collapse, the Philistines are probably the Sea Peoples. So the Philistines are actually a group of people of probably Greek descent who came into Israel at some point. The general consensus seems to be around the time of Bronze Age collapse, like sometime around like 1200 BC or something like that. But then the Bible does mention Philistines before then, so it's possible that they were there before then in some way as well. There can be two arrivals of something perhaps. But anyways, good old battle Goliath has come along and he's threatening everybody and demanding 1v1 combat, which is probably his best bet for victory. But Israel does not seem to be very eager to acquiesce to his demands. Maybe we should continue on. I think we left off at verse 9.
Okay. Okay, so from verse 10. Okay. And the Philistines said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle. And the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. And Jesse said to David his son, Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain, and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. And also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took the provisions and went, as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked to them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And David said to the men who stood by him, What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way. So shall it be done to the man who kills him.
All right, let's stop here for a second.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of get a sense of the scale of Israel from this story, which is that David is, regularly walking food, or maybe not regularly because this seems to be the first time, but he is in fact just walking food to his brothers and going to see if they're all right. Israel is not exactly a large nation, and this is going from like the middle of it to a little further to the west. So he could definitely walk that probably in a day. I'm not going to say that for certain because I'm not an expert in walking long distances, but there's some interpreters who suggest that hearing the first words that a character says in the Bible is often a good way to understand sort of what their general deal is in the story. And we see in David sort of the duality of man. What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? So we sort of see like, how dare he? But also, what can I get? If somebody were to take him out, what would they get in return? And this sort of is the general characterization of David throughout Samuel. He's a person who is deeply devoted to the Lord, except occasionally when he isn't. But also, he's a very savvy person politically. He knows how to get good things. He's very wise, and perhaps fittingly so, because he is the father of Solomon, although perhaps Solomon's wisdom is more supernatural, perhaps. But we're going to see this general tendency that David often gets things to go his way. And in some cases, it's divine favor. And in some cases, maybe a little bit of political trickery or just regular trickery.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So let's continue on from 28.
Okay. Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the man. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, What have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away from him toward another, and spoke in the same way. And the people answered him again as before. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them. for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord will be with you. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David, with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand.
Let's stop there for a second.
Mm-hmm.
So, I've got an interesting quote here from the Lutheran Study Bible from Ambrose. It says, David was chosen from among all to rule the people. How gentle and kindly he was, humble in spirit too, how diligent and ready to show affection. Before he came to the throne, he offered himself in the stead of all. So we see here that David is representing the people in this not as spiritual battle as Jesus will have, but a somewhat spiritual battle, yet the same. And so in the same way, Jesus represents us in our spiritual battle, and the battle is, of course, the Lord's. Yeah. And he intends to kill the Philistine with his own sword, which is quite the called shot if he can pull it off, considering that, I mean, it's not every day that your battle plan is to steal your enemy's weapons and use them against them.
Mm-hmm.
So let's carry on from 48.
Okay. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Shaharaim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent.
All right, we'll stop there for a second. So, David does, in fact, take Goliath's sword and kill him with it. In the same way, Jesus tramples down death by death. He uses the enemy of the devil, which is to kill, in order to bring life to all. And then David does a very interesting thing. So where does he take Goliath's head?
Wait a minute, where does he take his head? Wait a minute, he took to the to Jerusalem.
Yes. So what is strange about that?
Jerusalem is where the Ark of the Covenant is?
No.
Is it at this point?
In fact, what's strange about this is the exact opposite. Jerusalem is not actually a city that is inhabited by Israelites at this point.
Oh, okay.
Jerusalem is still actually Jebus at this point, and it is inhabited by the Jebusites. So, if anything, this is another one of his called shots, a bit of a threat or an indication of his aspirations, perhaps.
Okay, to
I mean,
clear them out. Okay,
yeah,
okay, yeah.
he walks into Jerusalem, effectively a foreign city, and just drops Goliath's head there, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
and then takes Goliath's armor and puts it into his tent. Now,
Okay, wait a minute. So up to this point, has Jerusalem ever belonged to Israel up to this point?
No,
Not at all. Okay.
not at all.
But he knows that Jerusalem is where it's supposed to be, like that.
Well, I mean, that is the question. Why does David want Jerusalem? I mean, you could say that there are some political reasons why Jerusalem would be very good. I mean, it's right on the border of Benjamin, which means it's closer. It's a pretty much within Judah, the closest you can be to everywhere else. So it's got that going for it. There are some interesting spiritual connections. Jerusalem is probably where Melchizedek was from back in the time of Abraham,
Okay.
to whom Abraham gave a tenth of everything. So there's kind of an interesting mystery there. Jerusalem is actually the hill on which Jerusalem was built was the hill actually where Abraham didn't sacrifice Isaac. So it has a lot of interesting symbolic meaning up to this point. So it could be potentially a very valuable place. After all, as they say, on the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. So.
Okay. And was it already a city at this time?
Yes, we'll see that it has like walls. So.
Okay.
Let's carry on to the end of the chapter, I guess.
Okay. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, As your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And the king said, Inquire whose son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from the striking down of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, Whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant, Jesse the Bethlehemite.
So it's suggested that there is possibly a bit of like a moving around temporally of stuff that happened because as we know, Saul has already met David at this point.
Yeah.
So probably what's happened is one story is like out of place in terms of like the exact order that things happened. That's probably what's going on. And there could be a variety of reasons why that could be the case.
Okay, so do you mean that it could be that David only started playing the harp after killing Goliath, like for Saul?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I'm suggesting.
Okay.
And there could be a few reasons for this. The one that I think is the most likely, but I also have absolutely no proof for at all, so this is just pure speculation, is that we know that at least 3 prophets existed and wrote something about David, thanks to what the Book of Chronicles says. The Book of Chronicles says, like, hey, if you want to read more about David, read these 3 sources. And one of them is Samuel, one of them is Nathan, and one of them is Gad. And so what I suspect is happening is that, like, up until chapter 16, that is stuff that Samuel wrote, and then that's the end. And now we're reading somebody else's stories about David. And so the reason why there's like a story out of place would be that Samuel just like didn't write about that because he wasn't there. And so he ends it with anointing David to be king. And then we're now reading like Nathan Gad or something. That's my best guess. Um, but it's purely a guess. I have absolutely no proof.
Okay, did Samuel write the end of the book of the first Samuel?
No.
Because he's already
Samuel.
dead.
Oh, yeah. By the end of First Samuel, Samuel will also already be dead, and also
Okay.
the end of First Samuel isn't like special. I guess is the best way to put it, because like there's not like actually a barrier between First and Second Samuel the way there is between like First and Second Corinthians. Those are like two separate letters. But First and Second Samuel, it's just like scroll's too long, cut it here, and we're going. So there is like a bit of like a story reason why you might stop there, but in terms of like composition, this is originally one thing.
Okay.
First and Second Samuel are one book. We just the end of First Samuel just is
Okay.
right
So
when
does
Saul
that mean
dies.
Nathan is writing what we just read then?
I mean, that's my guess.
Okay.
I have absolutely no proof aside from the fact that I just thought about it a few seconds ago and thought that makes sense.
Yeah.
But we do know that 3 prophets did write about David according to the Book of Chronicles, and that probably those 3 prophets' works were used to make the Book of Samuel.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So we're probably not going to get to the end of of chapter 18, but let's start going and see how far we go.
Mm-hmm.
Up to verse 5 for now, I guess.
Okay. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants.
So basically what has happened here is that Jonathan has effectively just like given up his right to the throne, basically. I mean, he has given David all of his good gear and most importantly, his robe, which, you know, as we've mentioned earlier, is a sort of sign of rulership over the land. Earlier, Saul, you know, tore Samuel's robe, and Samuel said, "In the same way, the nation will be torn away from you." So David has been promoted to the big army general, which in the ancient world and also the modern world, basically any place that is not completely politically stable, this is the sort of job that you're going to get if you're going to, you know, maybe become king via a show of force. So perhaps Saul's future paranoia that we're about to see is not entirely unjustified. Let's carry on from verse 6.
Okay. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated. Saul has struck down his thousands, David his 10,000s. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom?" And Saul eyed David from that day on. The next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, "I will pin David to the wall." But David evaded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them.
So we've got, well, we've kind of got a variety of problems here. One is just plain old envy, but also Saul's being oppressed by, harmful spirits. And so he is in a variety of ways not in the best state to make helpful judgments. And so he thinks, oh, yes, I'll just, stab David. Not only will this be, good, but it will, also be successful. He manages to evade him twice. And we see here a certain amount of humility, perhaps, on David's part, or perhaps just the inevitable result of this political system. Maybe he just, who could he possibly appeal to? But that he, sticks to his job despite the fact that his employer is throwing spears at him. Not a word that comes out of his mouth, so to speak. But yes, evidently this is not a setup that can last for very long. Let's continue on, yes.
Okay. Then Saul said to David, "Here is my elder daughter, Merab. I will give her to you for a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles." For Saul thought, "Let not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him." And David said to Saul, "Who am I, and who are my relatives, my father's clan in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king?" But at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to the king, she was given to Adriel the Meholathite for a wife. Okay. Now Saul's daughter Michal loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. Saul thought, "Let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." Therefore Saul said to David a second time, "You shall now be my son-in-law." And Saul commanded his servants, "Speak to David in private and say, Behold, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now then, become the king's son-in-law." And Saul's servants spoke those words to the ears of David. And David said, "Does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and have no reputation?" And the servants of Saul told him, "Thus and so did David speak." Then Saul said, "Thus shall you say to David, the king desires no bride price except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged of the king's enemies." Now Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. And when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. Before the time had expired, David arose and went, along with his men, and killed 200 of the Philistines, and David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him his daughter Michal for a wife. And when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy continually. Then the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed.
So we see a classic strategy being employed here, which David is going to perfect, and it's actually going to work for him later, which is just get somebody else to kill him. If he dies in war, nobody will suspect that, this was what I was secretly hoping for. But unfortunately for Saul, the Lord is with David. And it appears that in fact he doubles the bride price. There is a bit of a question later, because some point in 2 Samuel, he says that he paid the bride price of 100 foreskins. but here it kind of sounds like he gave 200. Like he definitely killed 200 Philistines.
Mhm.
I think that David later is just describing what the price was and not, how much he actually gave.
Mhm.
But at any rate, David is greatly outperforming Saul in every possible way. Interestingly, the Lutheran Study Bible indicates that you know the Philistines were, of course, uncircumcised as people who lived outside of Israel, but they noted, and I suspected that this would have been true, but had never actually noticed it, that the Edomites, the Moabites, and the Ammonites all practiced circumcision, which
Mm.
makes sense because they were all related to Abraham. The
Mhm.
Edomites, of course, being from Esau, and the Moabites and the Ammonites being descendants of Lot. So I suppose it would make
Descendants of who?
Lot. It's
Of
Abraham.
Lot. Oh, okay,
Yeah,
okay, okay,
yeah.
okay.
So now there is perhaps a bit of a question of like, who else actually does do that? Because there do seem to be like some other Semitic cultures that do it as well, but did they get it from Abraham? I don't know.
Well, the
That is a
Arabs,
question
right?
for,
I mean, the Muslims, right? Or Arabs?
yeah,
What? Yeah.
yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, Muslim's the religious thing, and then Arab would be more like a ethnic
Yeah.
thing.
Culture.
But
Yeah.
I mean, they probably got it. I mean, there's a couple of places they could have gotten it. One is just like in a roundabout way through Christianity and Judaism. Another is possibly that they're just Ishmaelites, and so they got it from that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
because the descendants of Ishmael went into like Arabia-ish, somewhere around there.
Mhm.
Um, and interestingly, we know that people around that area worshipped idols that had no images. They were just like blocks of wood or of stone.
Oh, okay.
It's uh, I maybe I mentioned this the other day. I've definitely mentioned this to a couple of people lately, but it's almost like, at some point one of their ancestors told them like, all right, now don't make images of anything on the earth. They're like, all right, we won't make any images, and eventually,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Huh.
it's
And I guess that's where the Muslims get the idea of not making images of people or.
yeah. Well, I think there's something going on there. Like from what I understand, like the Kaaba was, which is the thing that the Muslims make the pilgrimage to, was originally one of these things. Like it's just a big box that like represents God or is an image of God or whatever, but isn't. Um, and there seems to be like some sort of like weird fusion between whatever they were up to in that area and like actual like Jewish/Christian convictions that led to their absolute hatred of images. And then you get the iconoclastic controversy, which is kind of caused by the presence of Islam in the area of like, all right, so should we have pictures of Jesus or not? That happens in the 7th century, like they're kind of debating this because some people are like, well, it would be very convenient actually if we just decided we shouldn't have pictures of Jesus because then the Muslims wouldn't fight us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that that is partially why Eastern Orthodox Christians put such a high importance on icons. Like it's not just like a purely like theological, like, oh, we've decided we can, but specifically because Muslims were constantly telling them, no, you can't. You're not allowed to do this. The fact that they was a sort of confessional statement.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yes. But here we have a different kind of image of Christ, typological image of Christ, in which uh, his ancestor David shows us how Christ will also take the weapons of the evil one and
Mhm.
use them to slay them.
Mhm. Earlier in the chapter, when it talks about how he was supposed to marry the first daughter, and then she gets given to somebody else, I guess is that just like that's just like not important to the story? It's just a bit of history, or what?
Well, I think it just goes to show how slippery Saul is being in his dealings with David. Um, Kind of Jacob like almost, except that instead of being married to the wrong woman, he's instead not married to the woman he was trying to marry in the first place.
Yeah.
I think that basically Saul told that to David in the hopes that David would just get killed. Um,
Oh yeah.
but then he didn't die. And so Saul's like, well, I wasn't gonna like actually do this. But then he's like, well, I do have another daughter. So what if we try the same trick twice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and isn't it funny how later on David is going to use that trick on Bathsheba's husband?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we can sort of see the kind of dual nature of, well, all Old Testament types really, which is that they're both like Jesus and also importantly not like Jesus. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and so they show us what is to come, while also showing us why it is so necessary.
Mm.
So I'll read us Psalm 57. Uh, this is to the choir master according to Do Not Destroy, which is probably a tune or something. Song of David when he fled from Saul in the cave. Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me, for in you my soul takes refuge. In the shadow of your wings will I take refuge till the storms of destruction pass by. I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. He will send from heaven and save me. He will put to shame him who tramples on me. God will send out his steadfast love and his faithfulness. My soul is in the midst of lions. I lie down amid fiery beasts, the children of man, whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. They set a net for my steps. My soul was bowed down. They dug a pit in my way, but they have fallen into it themselves. My heart is steadfast, O God, my heart is steadfast. I will sing and make melody. Awake, my glory. Awake, O harp and lyre. I will awake the dawn. I will give thanks to you, O Lord, among the peoples. I will sing praises to you among the nations. For your steadfast love is great to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. And we will see very soon that David will, in fact, praise God among the nations because um, he is not going to be welcome in Saul's court for much longer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I will stop recording now.